Welcome, everybody. I would first of all like to acknowledge that we're on sacred lands that have not been ceded, and we are very, very honoured to have our guest of honour, Marina Benjamin, with us. I'm just going to read it from the book because I can't remember everything she's done. She's amazing. Where's that? Hang on. Where's the... Oh, dear me. She's a writer and an editor, author of too many books to mention, and I've got them all here and I'm going to hold them all up. She's award-winning. She's been longlisted for the Wingate Prize. She has worked as a journalist. She's written for places that I'd kill to write for, The New Statesman, and you're now
I'm with
editor.
Aeon magazine.
Aeon, yeah, which is one of my favourites, with wonderful long reads if you're interested in that. She's basically a polyglot, and she's just told me, I'm not sure I'm allowed to say this, that she's working on a novel now. So she's very genre fluid and very talented in every genre, everything that she sort of puts her hand to. And it's a little bit hard to know what we're going to talk about today, but I think we're going to loop around a lot of different things because we range from, and these are only the books I've got copies of, Last Days in Babylon, which is an extraordinary story that we'll get into later, dealing with her Iraqi Jewish heritage. We have Insomnia, which takes a really interesting look at what happens if you cannot sleep. We'll get into that in a moment. We have The Middle Pause, which is dealing with change of life. And we have, this is your latest, A Little Give, which I really loved because it talks about, it was written during COVID, during lockdowns, and talks about pretty much what comes out of doing things like cleaning and housework and the things that are revealed while you're doing things. So things you think about when you're kind of not thinking actively. And I think there's a bit of a thread between those three books about that. But just to launch us into Marina's writing, I'd like her to just read a little snippet from Insomnia because I think proof's in the pudding. And she's such an exquisite writer, and I encourage you all to run after this session and buy as many of her books as you can.
I couldn't ask for a better advert. I mean, literally I'm going to read snippets, so like 2 paragraphs, just to give you a taste of, because they're kind of different really, but there are, I suppose when you've been at this job for as long as I have, you find there are recurring themes in your work and you keep, you go round and back on things and you retrace paths. But this is just a little bit from Insomnia. Love, like sleep, requires immeasurable trust, a fall into the unknowing, says one scholar of sleeplessness. But let's bring the two into more intimate proximity. In Insomnia, we encounter the very heart of love's darkness, the essential otherness of the beloved. When Z and I began regularly sharing a bed together, after that first restive night, our sleep dovetailed into perfect accord. It was harmonious. We were like the ancient landmass of Pangaea fused into a single state of being. But then slowly, incrementally, a continental drift set in, and we began to separate bodily, imperceptibly at first, one complaining of overheating, the other of needing their own pillow. And before we knew it, each of us, me and Zzz, had become continents in our own right, miniature tectonic entities separated by a swathe of night. Shall I read one more paragraph? Every now and then I steal a look at Zzz's sleeping form, melding into the blackness of the night, blended into virtual immateriality, and I long to buy a ticket to sail over to his continent, away from snore awake and restive tossing, and across to the land of peaceful slumber.
How wonderful is that? I'm so jealous. I want to actually... Yes. I do have a microphone. Can everybody hear me? Great. I want to just take off on this whole idea of continence, because I think there's something that fascinates me about the spaces that we inhabit, and maybe that sort of dovetails into your other work as well, even the book about Iraq, in that insomnia, and I'd never thought about it this way until I'd read your work, we are living in another space, in another country if we're not sleeping.
Yeah.
And it also occurs to me that's sort of what we do as writers as well. Like, you know, when I'm writing, I'm not present in the land kind of thing. So do you want to just talk about that a bit?
Yeah, it's very interesting, that whole idea of where you're present and where you feel present. I mean, writing, you're present to yourself, but you're not present to anyone else. Insomnia, people think of as kind of, oh, you're not sleeping, defined in the negative. So, but actually, you're intensely present to the night, and your mind is intensely present. But I think also you're exiled from sleep, and I'm interested in states of exile too. So, and I think as a woman as well, you're in a state of exile.
Do you want to talk a bit more about that?
Yeah, I mean, I think I've explored it in those 3 books, which the ones that you say sort of form a series, that kind of midlife trilogy, if you like, of looking at kind of different aspects of women's lives and different aspects of their self-identity. But this idea that you're not fully at home in the public sphere and you're not fully at home in the private sphere, and you're in this state of internal exile almost as a woman. And it feels to me to be a little bit endemic to the psyche of contemporary womanhood. This state of homelessness, if you like, and obviously it comes through in the Iraq book, that feeling of being spat out of the country, and that sense of otherness and exile. So yeah, I circle around those ideas a lot, I think, and I do very keenly feel the status of the outsider.
And that sort of that really fits beautifully with belonging, which is the whole thematic of this festival.
Yes.
Well, where do you belong? I mean, you have so many characters in your head of who you are or who you aren't. Where do you belong?
I don't know. I think I belong in my books, actually, funnily enough. That's where I feel most present. And that's levelled at me. I say this in Insomnia, actually, that is levelled to me by my partner. That idea of, you're most present for your books. And, you need to be more present.
Does he get jealous?
Yes, I think so. I think so. And I actually, because that is part of my nature, I then subterfuge. I then hide my... the fact that I want to put my computer on all the time, because that's where I have the conversation with myself. That's where my consciousness resides. I sometimes think if someone took my computer, I'd be struck mute, actually, strangely, but...
I'll lend you my pen.
Yes.
When did that start? When did you decide that writing was your sort of belonging?
Later than it should have, really, because that feeling of otherness was started very early, and I thought that was the question that you were asking, because I think being a kind of Iraqi Jew in London, actually growing up in the 70s, which was a little bit like now in London, full of kind of racial hatred and people on the street wanting otherness, other out. That was the environment that I grew up in. But feeling at home in writing came slowly and much later, because I found writing a real chore initially. So to make it feel like a homey place took a very long time. Yeah.
So what was your trajectory into it? Like, just tell us about, sort of school and...
Well, it wasn't something that was encouraged in my family. My family were not bookish, so I didn't grow up having books around. They didn't know what to give me to read either, but they very much wanted me to be someone who had an education and could further myself in the world. So they gave me reference books. So when you said you were interested in stones, I didn't tell you this, but I know a lot about rocks.
Great.
I know about rocks, I know about space exploration. I have these strange pockets of knowledge because I was fed on reference books. I know a lot about birds too, but never mind. We'll go kind of that another time.
That's fascinating because I remember getting, in 1967, getting the Encyclopedia Britannica, all the volumes.
Yes.
And my brother, I was sort of just enamoured with the whole thought of having an encyclopedia. And my brother committed to reading it A to Z. The whole damn thing. And
I'm sure we'd
was
have
reading
a lot
the novels.
to talk about. Yeah, you were reading the novels.
Oh, wow.
So I
that's
kind of
amazing.
came to the literary side of things much later, yeah.
Maybe this is a good segue into just, I mean, we've got so much to cover in so little time. We could be here for 3 hours, but I just want to kind of talk about The Last Days of Babylon. This isn't available, and I had to go trawling for it on the internet, but if you can get it, it's brilliant. I just want to talk a little bit about this and what motivated you to write the book. We started before you in the green room. Sorry,
Yes.
I can't remember what, but we might have to retrace some of what we were talking about your grandmother and your trip to Iraq, and just give us a little insight into that book.
Well, the motive was just a very typical soppy one, which is I wanted my child to know about this history because, you know, there's no connection anymore. It doesn't exist. The community's been spat out. And actually, you know, I didn't have that much connection to it. My grandmother, for me, was like the last in the line. And
perhaps we could, I mean, Melbourne's a very kind of skewed Ashkenazi Jewish community. In fact, I grew up not even knowing there were Sephardic Jews.
Right.
So maybe
Potted
you could
history?
give us a little tiny history.
So the Jews of Iraq were kind of originally from Judea. That's where they were from, and they were captured by Nebuchadnezzar's army in the year 538, I think, BC, or 586. I don't have it at my fingertips, but it was 500 years before the birth of Christ. And that was the first sacking of the temple, so they were taken to Babylon and built the Hanging Gardens and various other things. They were set to work as labourers. And then Mesopotamia, as it was then, was invaded by Persia, and Cyrus, the king of Persia, who it invaded, was actually very liberal and said to the Jews, okay, you're not enslaved anymore, you can make your home here. This is generations in. But those of you who want to go back can go back to Judea. Well, most stayed by that point because they were living there for centuries by that point and were speaking Arabic. And then you see this twinning of the cultures, of the development of kind of Arabic culture and Jewish culture, Jewish Arabic culture, mingled and mixing. They become very hard to unpick.
And the language too.
And the language and the music and the dress and the food, it's all intermingled. I sometimes compare the Jews of Iraq to the Jews of Germany to the extent that they could not see a separation really between. I mean, of course they knew they had different faiths, but also I think we're jumping up to modern times, you know, the Jews in Iraq in Ottoman times were very free, actually. They were free to have their faith, they were free to take public office, they were not ghettoized except voluntarily. They lived very closed, inward-looking lives, but they were not persecuted. But then everything changed in the 20th century, and what had been hundreds and hundreds of years of accord changed into discord, and you had these rising tide of Arab nationalism at the same time as Zionism, and the Iraqi government just successive Iraqi governments didn't know how to handle these two forces that were pulling the population in different directions. And once the State of Israel was founded, it seemed to be the decisive thing that they couldn't reconcile any longer. So they thought it was just easier, it was just more expedient to just get rid of the Jews, which is what they did.
Yeah, I mean, one of my closest friends is of Iraqi Jewish heritage, and it fascinates me that, you know, when we compare my sort of, you know, shtetl background and her Baghdadi background, and she talks about, you know, Auntie Albertina and Auntie Victoria and Uncle Henry, and they were all very anglicised and they were all very well off and left Baghdad sort of very well-to-do and were transposed, and some of them went to Israel. And I know from personal experience, having lived in Israel for a long time, the Iraqi Jews were treated very badly, as if they're sort of these, you know, primitive people that had arrived and put in tents.
Yeah. It was, I mean, it was just the lack of understanding, I think, between the founders of the State of Israel and these people that they were bringing over, really. But the funny thing is, so the Iraqi Jews were not monolithic in the sense that, you know, the ones who spoke French and English and Turkish, and there were many of those, were not the majority, and they often could afford to go elsewhere. So some went to Tehran, some went to East, to China, some went to India, America, almost anywhere but Israel, actually, because they were not a Zionist community. And so the ones that were taken to Israel were by and large, I would say, not all the most educated classes. Although that's not entirely true. I don't want to overgeneralize. Certainly members of my family ended up in Israel and were educated and found life very difficult, found it confronting that their culture, their history, often their profession wasn't recognized.
Let's just segue a little bit now in terms of belonging. I wonder what inspired you in 2004 to undertake a very adventurous journey and actually go, and I say back to Iraq in the same way that I went back to Poland, not that I'd ever been there. But what was the motivation behind that?
Well, I'd already embarked on the book at this point, and I just thought, I have to go. I just thought, I can't write an authentic book unless I can speak authentically, and I can't speak authentically unless I've been there. And then I also wanted to do two things. I wanted to see what was left of Jewish Baghdad, because at one point, 40% of the population of Baghdad was Jewish.
40%?
40%
Wow.
of the city was Jewish in the 20th century.
What numbers are we talking?
About 150,000 at one point. And they were everywhere in society, Jews. So I thought, well, there'll be traces. I'll go and find things. I'll go to the old house that they lived in, and I'll see mezuzahs on the door, and I'll go to synagogues. And there was nothing there. There was just nothing there. But also the other thing I wanted to do was I knew there were 22 Jews left. And I knew this because suddenly a cousin popped up and contacted my mother and said, we're second cousins. And she escaped Saddam Hussein's Iraq in the year 2000. My mother didn't even know of her existence. Right. And she gave me addresses of all the Jews, well, not all of them, but some of the Jews who were left. And she knew all of them. And she said, they're 23. Oh 23.
And did you meet them?
Not all of them. One or two didn't want to meet me. One or two had converted to Islam, or were more or less converted to Islam. And then slowly, once one or two had met me, others were willing to meet me. One woman, it was very emotional, actually. I felt very emotional because I looked at them and I thought, if it wasn't for the different histories, I would be in your shoes. And that was a very freaky thought because they had so little options, they weren't liberated by the Americans. They were plunged into uncertainty and danger. They felt very, very leery of speaking to outsiders. But I also had one woman who literally physically threw herself at me and said, save me, take me with you.
Oh my God.
It was very, very difficult. I felt totally impotent. Although what I did do, actually, I arrived with a suitcase with kosher meat, because that was what they couldn't get. And so I thought, well, one thing I can bring is this vacuum-sealed kosher meat. I'll give it as a gift. It'll be my calling card. And it had Hebrew letters. on it that I'd scratched
Oh,
out,
okay.
thinking, well, I don't want it to be picked up in customs. But
Who can see a Spielberg movie here? I mean, I'm visualising. What an extraordinary, courageous
I'm
thing
glad
to do
I did
too.
it. I'm glad I did it. It ended up being really foolhardy because I was taking all my advice about going into Baghdad from war correspondents because they were the only people I knew who'd been in. And then it was when I got there I realised, but war correspondents are insane. Because the level of danger they're willing to put up with, I was not willing to put up with that level of danger. And it was like, oh my God. And I went at absolutely the wrong time, it turned out. I couldn't have gone at, well, I could have gone at a worse time, but I went in the 1-year anniversary of shock and awe. And they were going to celebrate that anniversary with some bombings of Western people. So, yeah, that was... it was quite hairy, but also tremendously exciting. I have to say, I'm a bit of a danger junkie.
Oh,
so
my goodness.
I did enjoy
talking
it.
about being a danger junkie,
Yeah.
I'm aware of time passing. I want to put you in the kitchen.
Oh,
Let's talk about dangerous things.
Dangerous things in the
that happen
kitchen.
when you're mopping the floor and washing the dishes. And
yeah. I think, is that a cue for another reading?
yeah.
So this book that Leah introduced is, it's a book about all the invisible labour that women do. It's about how women hold the world together and no one gives a damn or pays any attention or pays them any money for it. So the chapters are called things like cleaning, feeding, pleasing, launching, all the things that women do. And I'll just read you a very short bit, which is, so there's a kind of madness. I don't know if you women in the audience recognize this, but there's a kind of madness that seizes you when you end up doing some of these menial jobs that are repetitious and tedious, and you don't want to do them, but you have to do them, and you're the only one who does them, and if you don't do them, they don't get done. So you do them, but your mind, you try and float away so that you're not really doing them, or because you get so angry if you thought about it too hard. Anyway, I wanted to try and capture some of that madness in this chapter, Cleaning. In a single moment, I see myself as others might see me, a dogged woman squatting on the kitchen floor, skirt hitched up around her thighs, head pressed forward, one hand splayed on the tiles for balance. The other hand, the left, is making determined circular passes across one of the tiles, scrubbing it clean with a baby wipe. In this moment, I exist on multiple planes. I see myself from the outside and I think, this is madness, this crazed cleaning of an already clean floor. I think that a middle-aged woman on her knees in the kitchen has lost the plot, or lost herself, or is lost in a task of such meaninglessness that it must offer some meditative balm. Inside my head, thoughts flutter about, come to rest for a second, assume definite shape, then flutter off again. All the work of the hand is rooted in thinking, Heidegger wrote. The hand does not only grasp and catch or push and pull, the hand reaches and extends, receives and welcomes. The hand carries, the hand designs and signs. Heidegger was talking about handiwork, the dignity of making things. He was talking about an artisanship rooted in skill and learning. Cleaning does not qualify. Cleaning is mindless work. In cleaning, even the hand is dumb. Down on the floor in the kitchen, I think only lowly thoughts. I think, look at this tile, strafed with solvent so powerful it can remove gloss paint from slate. I consider the wipe in my hand, and I think, this solvent is so potent. Imagine what it would do to a baby's bottom.
Brilliant issue. You talked about losing the plot, but I just wanted to ask you, when you do these sort of menial tasks or these sort of repetitive tasks, I often find I'm most drawn to do them when I'm trying to write a book.
Yeah.
Does that happen to you?
Yeah, it's a kind of escape route, isn't it? It's but also it's a way of getting to a bit of a Zen place. So
Let's talk about that. The things that come out when you are in those sort of liminal
Yeah.
spaces, like not sleeping, on scrubbing the floor, that sort of space.
yeah, and that's interesting, that liminal space. I think that's where women go for refuge, actually. I think
Refuge
it's
from what?
from the inequality and unfairness of their lives. So from the difficulty, the contradictions of being a modern woman, I think are kind of impossible to reconcile, actually. And so I think women go to these liminal places to escape. They don't necessarily say, oh, I'm going to go off there, but it's unconscious. We all need these escape valves, because otherwise we're back to this idea of internal exile. We're not quite belonging in the public sphere, which is totally shaped by patriarchal. Everything about it is shaped by patriarchy. Nor are we at home in the domestic sphere. If you're a woman who wants to liberate yourself from the home, then you're an exile in your own home, and all the tasks that you have to do become fraught with contradiction. And that was what I was trying to get at there. So the liminal space, in a way, is a space where you can feel a little bit more free, because it's not tethered to anything. And by definition, it's not tethered to anything. And it's a kind of a place where the mind is free to roam, I guess. And that's, in the end, I think, where I got with the insomnia, which is, towards... So it's a book that does not look at insomnia as an affliction. It looks at it, as you were saying, as an altered state of mind. So we're in the liminal from the beginning. And so where can you take this travel? Where can you go in this liminal space? What can you find in this liminal space? And I think that's a lot of what I'm interested in, actually, generally, across all the books.
Well, I kind of I think when I look at what I've read of your oeuvre, how do you say that word? It's sort of, you go to spaces that don't really exist. And I guess also while you're writing, it's almost like you don't exist in the world. That you're
Yes.
sort of in that, I don't know, transit lounge or something.
Yes.
And that's where all the ideas are.
Yeah. I
Firing,
think you asked me, we're circling back to the beginning, because you said, where do you feel at home? And I said, when I'm inside my computer. And I think that's the liminal space. And I do want to write about that. I want to write about absence, and I like to write about invisibility and voicelessness. Those are the things that interest me, the absences. But because if you scratch at the surfaces of the absences, what you normally find is a woman. That's what you find. You'll find women who are there, who inhabit the absences.
I'm probably going off on a bit of a tangent, but what strikes me as you're speaking is I was having a conversation with my son the other day, who's a neuroscience geek, and they're doing really interesting work with mapping the pathways of the brain, and it's a different form of AI that doesn't use all the fuel and fossil fuels.
Right.
But what he was saying is that you're born with infinite possibilities. As a baby, your neural pathways are just completely open. And I'm going to circle back. But what happens is that as you develop, you form these sort of formed pathways of your choice, and the others shut down and kind of wither away. And the theory also with affliction, with things like neurodevelopmental issues is that you don't close down a lot of these pathways. A lot of them are staying too open. Where am I going with this? I'm just wondering whether there's something actually neurological about these spaces that you inhabit. Insomnia, cleaning, where you're kind of present but absent. These liminal spaces, whether there is something to do with the wiring, with the creativity that's involved with that. This is a long bow to draw, and I don't know why I'm going here, but just putting it out there.
Gosh, I don't know. I mean, when you were talking about that idea of infinite possibilities, I mean, I was interested in that. I addressed that in midlife, but maybe from the telescope, the telescope end of that, where the idea that the longer you live, the more possibilities you exhaust, because you close down pathways by making choices. So I think what part of the shock of midlife is that you don't have a sense of possibility. You lose that sense of possibility because you've already made choices about things. It's an illusion, I think, partly, but I think people feel the impact of that emotionally. I think a lot of people in midlife feel, oh my God, I could have done this and I could have done that. Why didn't I do this or that? And here I am in this place, and I don't really want to be here. That was the sort of midlife issue that interested me, actually.
And you cover that in your book, because you talk about that sort of that drive to strive up until you hit the top of the bell curve, and then it's all downwards. But you flip the bell curve in your book. In a way. The middle pause is wonderful.
So it's an economic, it's not economic, psychological, sociological theory. It seems to hold true across cultures and across nations. It's the happiness curve. So the happiness curve looks something like that. It has a dip in it, and the dip is midlife. And survey after survey after survey has shown that people between around the ages of 45 to 55 get really miserable, and then you get happier as you get older again. And I'm fascinated by this, by the consistency of this, actually. And I feel like I'm just coming out of it. And I was laughing to myself when I was thinking about talking about this here today, because I was thinking about, because when I was in the dip, when I wrote that book, at the bottom of the curve, I was thinking, I don't believe you get happier. And why would you get happier? Why? You're only going to get older. Everything's only going to get worse. But then I realised, now I am older, the uptick is because so many people I know are dying. So you become so grateful. You just become so grateful for every day you've got. That's the happiness curve. It's not got to do with...
But is it also you give less shits?
Yes. So there's another difference here. This is a little anecdote I'll tell. I was travelling with a group of friends about a year ago, and it was a bunch of people in middle age. And you know how when you travel, your mind expands and you sort of get really serious and have these serious discussions. And I was speaking to this guy, and his wife was sitting behind us, and it was a small plane. And he was asking me about midlife, and we were talking about that thing about, in midlife, you change the way your attitude to the world. And he said, yeah, I know what you mean. He said, I've just decided to say yes to everything. And instantly, his wife and me burst out laughing, both of us, because the women in midlife, what they realize is they can start saying no. That was the difference. And that's part of the happiness curve, the kind of, give no shits. Yeah.
Wow. I'm just aware of the time, and I did want to include the audience in our conversation too. I sort of feel like we've done a bit of a performative dance for you here, of kind of emptying our minds of what it is to be a writer. This is sort of the way you think of all these. But I wonder if anyone's got any questions, and I do ask that they are questions and not huge statements and sharing your entire life story and when you want to write your novel, please. Is there anyone? I know you're burning to ask questions. Come on, you've got this woman here. And could you do you mind to stand up and talk loud so we can all hear you?
I used to resent any cleaning, and I used to make it such a chore. And I don't know, perhaps midlife, I decided just enjoy it. And I didn't enjoy it, but then I started actually thinking, this is mindless, and why not just do it and not worry about it? And I started actually not minding it. It was weird, and I mean,
So what is the question?
What was the question? That it's actually okay sometimes to clean, because it can relax one.
Oh,
Yeah.
There's a question.
I do think so. I mean, I think that, I talk a bit in the book about Simone de Beauvoir, because she talks about this difference between transcendence and immanence, which of course is another patriarchal category, this whole separation between mind and body, and because the men said, we're all mind, and you guys, your body, your material, and you belong to nature and dirt and all that stuff down there. And where am I going with this? So Simone de Beauvoir talks about housework, and she says housework binds you to the realm of immanence, and therefore I don't want anything to do with it. And people take to housework, this is to come to your point about enjoying it. She says some women take to housework as others take to drink. Right? like a kind of addictive, mindless thing, but she sees it as a neurotic impulse, but she's very worried about this binding to imminence. And I'm trying to challenge that a little bit in the book, because even though I don't like Housework, and I don't enjoy it, I actually resent it deeply, I'm trying to find some little crumb of solace in this idea that maybe imminence, being in the midst of life, has something to teach us.
But if you find the crumb of solace, you've got to clean it up anyway.
Yes, that's right.
Think that,
Could you stand? We just can't hear you, sorry.
do you think that the younger generation have the same kind of attitudes where, couples are really sharing domestic and
Yeah.
and earning roles? Do you think that they really have the same kind of life that you're describing and the same attitudes about places?
Is it changing, basically?
Is it changing? Probably less than we think. I think less than we think, and I think partly because what happens is wait till they have children. When those young couples, then immediately the women end up doing more. And I've seen this happen so many times, where the men are, we'll share everything, etc. And then when it comes to who's staying at home and who's going to go to work, it's very rarely, I think, the woman who ends up going to work. Yeah, but who gives up work when the children come? Who's the one who gives it up? Mostly it's the women. And the other thing is, I think that that generation, there are other things that are fraught about cleaning. So, I think hiring somebody to do your cleaning is another very fraught area, because often the liberation of one woman, the one doing the hiring, is bought at the expense of oppressing the other who's doing the cleaning. So that's a fraught thing too. So I don't know. I don't think things are changing as much. I think the problem is there still, the nub of it. It's always, in every relationship, it's an issue.
We've got more burning questions. Excellent. This gentleman here. Sorry?
This gentleman.
Oh, sorry. Beg your pardon.
Yeah, hi. Well, I'd like to put in a word for men. I'm a growing category of men called lats, living apart together, so I have to do, and I'm an older man, like in my 70s, and I heard the other day that something like 50% of households in America within 20 years will be single-person households, and I believe it's about 25% in Australia. So there's this whole world. I also do all the housework, have sleepless nights. I don't have midlife crisis, I'm past that. But the interesting area for you to look at this whole group of older people. So
Yeah.
But I sort of live in a parallel or different universe to you, where all the men I know do all the housework.
They don't hire people to clean.
No.
them.
I love housework.
I think there's an essay in this for you.
That's really interesting. I didn't even know there was a demographic like that. I mean, that's my ignorance.
All the guys. The kids are
Yeah.
gone, the wife's gone.
Yeah, and I see. Again, I wonder. I'm very. I haven't looked into this at all. But one thing I did find out when I was writing the middle pause was that actually, and you may disagree with me again, actually, but again, I was looking at studies that were showing that men were lonelier in midlife than women because of the way that the gendered patterning had happened in their earlier lives, so that women had networks of friends, deep networks of friends that they'd met through motherhood and all those menial things that women do, developed networks of friendships that continued and developed and flourished in late life, but it was very unusual for men to have the same networks. And so you got kind of this epidemic of loneliness among older men. Now, I don't know, it'd be very interesting to hear what you have to say to that.
Well, I think everyone's different, so...
Yeah.
And I sort of go, well, I know, like, the gay community, for example, and then there's people that are very social, people that have always been loners all their lives, so... But yes, I would agree that they tend to get stuck at home doing the housework.
We're running out of time. I think this is opening up, a whole new session, but fabulous. Thank you for sharing. This gentleman.
Yeah, can I ask a question? Can I ask a question about the last days in Babylon?
Yeah.
So what happens to a society when you tear 40% of the community out?
Yeah.
What happens?
Yeah, it is very interesting what happened. I think to some extent they lost their way, because I think Baghdad, like Cairo, both those cities were incredibly cosmopolitan cities at the end of the 19th century and the early 20th century. And, you know, you would see people in, not that this was an indication of anything, but you would see people in Western dress. It just shows an openness, you know. It wasn't just all people walking around in hijabs and chadors, but it, you know, there was modernity had arrived. You know, people were reading in other languages, studying in other languages. There were cars. You know, it wasn't a backward place, and it kind of it went backwards. It sort of rewound really, because they didn't just spit out the Jews. You know, other minorities started being oppressed as well. Arab nationalism triumphed, and partly it triumphed because it was a way of bringing different tribes together in Iraq. And we saw what happened when, you know, after the war in Iraq, was all those tribal differences came to light again. But for a while, under the banner of Arab nationalism, they united. And also, I suppose they united after kicking out the Jews because they felt that they'd done something in the interests of Arab nationalism, and so it felt like the right move. But things very quickly changed, and there were government was not stable. So you'll see in Iraq there was the succession, there was something like 19 governments in the span of a decade at that time. So it was very unstable. Yeah, it's a really interesting question.
Do we have time for one more?
question. Quick.
Just a quick question about your process and how you know what you're going to work on when, and you know, just whatever you can tell us about how you work.
Right. Well, I guess I didn't know I was going to do a trilogy. I really knew I wanted to write about midlife because it felt very urgent to me, and I was already writing memoir by that point, and I just thought I'm just going to throw caution to the wind and get really, really personal about it, and write really personally in real time about the trauma of midlife, and then I guess the second book followed really quickly actually on that. So Insomnia came very quickly after Middle Pause because I felt like there was more to say. And at that point I didn't think I was doing a trilogy. I'm not really answering your question. I suppose what I'd say, I get obsessed. And then when I'm obsessed, the thing won't leave me alone until I start writing, I guess. So, and that's my way of dealing with, so writing is partly about obsession, but it's also partly about clarifying the ideas that are, the things that are going around my head and muddled. It's a way of kind of giving them shape and form and meaning. And it is
in a way you're writing to understand what you're thinking.
Yeah, and maybe to give a little bit of form to those liminal spaces as well, because when you're inhabiting those liminal spaces, that's where the questions about your existential questions live in those liminal spaces, and so I guess I'm trying to address those questions.
Have we got time for one very quick one? I'm going to get in real trouble.
One word answer. What you're working now, Leah mentioned that you're writing a novel.
Yeah, it's I can't say very much about that.
Yeah.
It's difficult. I'm finding it difficult. It's an interesting change. We were talking about this. It uses a very different space in your head, non-fiction and fiction. It feels very different, but I'm really enjoying it. So much.
I want to thank you so much,
Thank
Marina,
you.
for putting up with me and my process. And thank you all for coming. I really am asking you now, seriously, go and buy her books. This is how writers live. To borrow it from your auntie isn't going to work. She has to sell books in order to write more books. So go support her.
Thank you.